So Oisin Feeney, welcome back to Crime World. I was going to say welcome there, but in fact we have already done this conversation before.
Yeah, it's a bit of a deja vu moment going on right now, isn't it?
We're going to pretend that didn't happen and I didn't lose the footage and the audio, and we're going to go over our conversation again. And this was I think it was a really interesting conversation we had, so hopefully we can do it some justice. So we're going to talk about the book that you chose for our book club, which was...
I'm just kidding. Killing Thatcher by Rory Carroll. So, it's a book that focuses on the plot to the Brighton hotel bombing, which was an attempt by the Provisional IRA to take out Thatcher. Very, very interesting story that's been told a few times. But this one I just thought was very well written narratively, kind of takes different characters and different pieces. It's kind of the way I like to tell my stories. It takes different pieces and brings them together to a culmination. And I like that style. So, yeah, that's the one we're going to do.
Yeah. So he begins this book, and I think he was very good at setting the cultural context sort of around the IRA at the time. And he starts off by telling us a bit about the death and the murder of Mountbatten. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that incident, I suppose, shaped the public's perception of republicanism?
Sure, yeah. I guess the assassination of Mountbatten it's where I launched my podcast as well. It's when I did because I do mine completely out of sequence. So, yeah, it was one of those things where it was kind of seen as a little bit of, I don't know, it was the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and a British royal was summering in his house, or his wife's house, I think, in Sligo, in the Republic of Ireland. So, I think the optics of it didn't look great. And so the Provisional IRA, in their eyes, they said, okay, this would be, if we could take out a British royal, this would be a huge PR, huge beneficial to our struggle, or their perceived struggle. So, they planted a bomb in his fishing boat, Shadow 5. And when Mountbatten went out with a number of members of his family, including a young Irish boy, Paul Maxwell, someone on the shoreline detonated the bomb and killed Mountbatten and a number of other people, including 2 children. So, it was kind of that's why I found it an interesting story to start the entirety of my podcast with, because of the character of Mountbatten was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The plot, what happened was interesting. And then kind of the, Republicans, some people were delighted. The Provisional IRA were delighted that they got Mountbatten. But at the same time, at what cost, to kill children? And for a lot of people in the Republic of Ireland that may have been leaning into republicanism or, supporting the IRA, killing kids to get to a monarch was too much. And I think that's a lasting sentiment that exists today, that people in the Republic of Ireland might not support what the IRA would have done. They might support a united Ireland, but they wouldn't support the sheer amount of civilians that were killed. For what purpose, you might ask now, 40 years later, So what was your question?
I think you answered it pretty succinctly.
Okay, because I'll do that a lot.
I suppose in terms of the public perception of the IRA, and when we're moving into this sort of incident, the attempt to assassinate Margaret Thatcher, there was growing support once again for the IRA, but not only that, but there was declining support for Margaret Thatcher, not only in Ireland, but also in the UK in terms of her policies and the Thatcher era. And I suppose after this all happened, there was praise from people in the UK, and queries as to why it had quote unquote failed. So I suppose I want to talk a little bit about Margaret Thatcher, what she was kind of like and why she would have been a target for the IRA.
Okay, well, to step back just a second there, I think, the assassination of Mountbatten and then the Warren Point ambush, which was an ambush that happened on the same day and killed, I think, 19 soldiers. It was a lot of British soldiers were killed. This was Thatcher's really first reckoning, I guess, with the provisional republicanism and, what her policy was against Republicans. And she came down hard. She came down very understandably. You have to respond in a certain way after attacks such as this, which really was a massive success for the Provisional IRA. So, then when the hunger strikes came around then in 1981, Thatcher, was perceived by many as, Thatcher's government is allowing these men to die. And that perception, I think, the hunger strikes were, in a way, that was a successful campaign because the tragedy of the men who died during the hunger strikes, they put the world attention was on the men, and Thatcher looked like she was kind of the one responsible for for causing it in a way, for killing the men. So it really put her kind of the crosshairs on her a little bit. There was a lot of hate for how she handled that and how the men ended up all dying the way they did. And then that being said as well, she was really unpopular over in the UK as well, the miners closing the mines. So yeah, there was a lot of resentment against her, I guess is the way to put it.
And I suppose as well, she did just happen to be the Prime Minister at the time during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I mean, had it been somebody else with different policies, it may still have been the case that the IRA would have tried to assassinate them.
Yeah, I don't know, was it Labour in power beforehand? But I think there was a little bit more wiggle room with successive or previous governments. So Thatcher was kind of seen as a very firm stance. Again, she refused to acknowledge, what was the hunger strikers? She refused to acknowledge there was no such thing as like political violence. It was just violence is violence. Crime is crime is crime. That's the quote.
Yeah.
And, she just didn't see a difference. If you kill someone for a political means or kill someone for a violent means, it doesn't matter. It's the same. Then this kind of segues into the Provisional IRA's campaign outside of Northern Ireland, if I can go into that a little bit.
Of course, yeah.
So, there's a crosshair on Thatcher at this time, and the IRA at this time has realised that, it's bombs in Belfast had become the norm. This had become an everyday occurrence. So there was a belief that if we can get bombs in London, in the heart of the British Empire, the British monarchy even, it's worth so much more. One bomb in London is worth 1,000 in Belfast was kind of the saying. So there was plans concocted to start attacking places around England, which had been occurring at this stage. This wasn't the first one. But what happened in the Brighton Hotel in 1984 at the Conservative Party conference was probably one of the IRA's most successful bombs in mainland Great Britain.
Yeah, and that's in terms of, I suppose, as part of a terrorist organisation. And I suppose as well, and not to glorify what they did at all, but I suppose when you look at the way they bombed, they were kind of seen as pioneers, and they were kind of seen as the gold standard of bombing. They had developed some very unique techniques that they had thought throughout the world.
Yeah, sure. The IRA went over to Colombia to teach FARC. So in exchange for drug money, cocaine money that FARC had amassed, the IRA taught them how to use their mortar bomb technology. And they also went down and helped with, what would you call them? People in Libya as well. Kind of, I kind of posit, a lot of the war on terror and stuff in Iraq and Afghanistan, some of these people may have been auxiliary trained by the IRA. By the information that was given down in Libya. So I probably need to look into that more. I think that's a bit of a wild thing to throw out.
Like the paramilitary world is so interesting in how it operates. It really is fascinating. And I have to admit, reading books on the Troubles is only something I very recently come to. I think I had that sort of young person who grew up in the Republic of Ireland kind of ignorance to what was really going on in the Troubles, especially being a child post, the Good Friday Agreement. But I have to say, when I do read about it, it's always just incredibly fascinating. And this book really does kind of bring the mix of the politics of not only the IRA and the UK, but also there is that facet of the crime and solving the crime. So I think that made it very interesting for me as somebody that's very interested in true crime. I suppose something I love about it is people love true crime and consume it for different things, whether it's the gore or you have an interest in the psychology of serial killers. For me, it's all about solving a puzzle. And I think the way that this was solved was quite interesting. So let's talk about the main events, I suppose, of the book, which is the IRA's attempt to kill Margaret Thatcher, as you said, at the Brighton Hotel, where she was staying with most of her cabinet for the Conservative Party's conference in October of 1984. Tell us about the bomb and how it ended up in the hotel, because that is it's a really interesting sequence of events.
I was going to segue into it, but the bomb making technology of the IRA is quite skilled. It had advanced over the years, and a lot of frequently it is said that the British Army never really knew before the bomb detonated what it was, and they had to go through the pieces and figure out to prevent future, because they were doing all sorts of crazy stuff. They started out with just milk churns, I think, but then fertilizer bombs, then gelignite bombs, then a lot of the Libyan supplied Semtex. So they had a huge amount of stuff coming in, and they had a very how do I describe this? Their engineering was very smart. So you could detonate bombs with camera flashes. You could detonate bombs from pulling a string. That was the more simple type. And then these sort of bombs were what would be known as long delay timer bombs. So these were bombs that were made that could be hidden away somewhere in a building. You take apart the masonry, put the bomb in, put it back together, and hope that it goes off. And in a lot of cases, these bombs, they did. And in this case, of course, it did. So the plan for this attack was they knew the Conservative Party conference was happening on these 3 days in this hotel. They knew that the security sweep done would be done a week before, no longer, because there was never the bombs. These 3-week timer bombs had never happened really before in this context. So, and they knew that the Conservative Party conference, the politicians would be getting the best rooms in the hotel, at the front of the hotel. So they said, okay, well, if we can plant a bomb somewhere in a room on the front of the hotel, and the bomb doesn't need to do a lot of damage, but if we can dislodge anything in the building, if we can collapse the hotel, we can have a huge death toll, which is what they wanted. So a plan was put in motion. And on the 15th of September, a man by the name of Patrick McGee, arrived at the hotel. And he was the man tasked with setting up, arming the bomb, and then getting out of town, basically.
So he checks into the hotel. Tell us a little about that.
So, yeah, there was a huge manhunt to find him afterwards. So all of these things came obviously in the aftermath. But, he arrived at the hotel in a taxi. He was dressed in heavy, thick coat, which was unusual. It was a hot day. He had a very heavy suitcase. Maybe that had the bomb. We're not sure because, anyway, I'll go on. So he checks in under the pseudonym Roy Walsh. And then back in the day before the internet or whatever, I sound so old, but, he would have had to write a signature down on like a card. And so he was very, very careful not to touch the card, to put any fingerprints on it. But his palm did leave an imprint on the card, which comes into play later on. And yeah, he stayed in the hotel for 3 days. We believe one person visited him that has never been identified. And then he checked out and he disappeared. And during that time, he had taken a panel underneath the bathtub in the hotel and installed the bomb. Set the timer. So he set the timer for, 24 days, 12 hours. Anyway, it was set to go off around 1 or 2 in the morning after the first day of the conference. So he planted the bomb and disappeared off into the night after 3 days.
And this bomb was put into, like I said, into one of the rooms, and the rooms that he assumed that the members of the Conservative Party would be staying in. Was Margaret Thatcher staying in that specific room?
No.
Or was she staying in one nearby?
So he stayed in room 629. It'd be 129, 229, 329, 429, okay? And they're all basically directly on top of each other, all rooms. So when will we go to the bomb detonating?
Let's go to the bomb detonating.
Okay, so the Conservative Party conference went off without a hitch, I guess. And Thatcher was back in her room. Her husband was in bed. And Thatcher was, I think, in the adjacent room or in the bathroom, preparing her notes for her speech the following morning. And it was at that moment, at 2:54 a.m. in the morning, the bomb detonated. And the way it worked is it detonated and it dislodged a 5-ton chimney stack, which crashed down and destroyed rooms ending in 8. So all the way down, the rooms ending in 8 got a 5-ton chimney stack went straight through them. And Thatcher was 1 room over in 9. So, it literally came between here and the door from killing her. Though her room had some damage, there was smoke and dust and things smashed. But it didn't kill her, but it did kill 5 people, who were, a lot of them I think were a couple of civilians and a couple of politicians as well.
And was there, I suppose, had she been in bed at that time, was her husband okay? Did he survive?
Yeah, so her room was not hit. So it was the adjacent room, but it was just like debris, some glass, that sort of stuff. So it was 1 room away from killing Thatcher, essentially.
Oh, that must have been, putting yourself in her shoes, no matter what kind of person you are or what you might perceive somebody as like, that must have been pretty terrifying for her. Did she comment about it afterwards? I mean, obviously the Conservative Party conference continued because they didn't want to show that they were,
I think it was her and her assistant and her husband who got whisked off in the car. I think that was what he mentioned in the book. And it was in the car where she kind of dropped her, she walked into the car like, I'm okay, I've survived. But then it was when she dropped like the sheer fear of what had just happened kind of hit her. So that's when they realized they had to go ahead with the conference. So, I think one of the shops opened up their doors and people, because everyone came out of the hotel was abandoned. Everyone was in their pajamas. So all the members were just allowed to go into the shop, grab whatever they wanted for clothing. And the bomb went off at 3 a.m. and I believe the conference started at 9 a.m. so 6 hours later, kind of saying, we will not be beaten by this bomb or the actions of the Provisional IRA, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think nowadays with what, experts know about terror and terrorist organizations, I don't think it probably would have gone ahead just for the sake of, security completely. And, we didn't get her at the bomb. We'll have to come back during the day and finish the job, so to speak. But tell us a little bit about that in the aftermath of what happened. Was there a claim by the IRA that they're the ones who did it, or was it kind of assumed straight away that that's who it was?
I'm not too sure exactly. The IRA usually put out their statements. Was that where the famous quote came from?
Yeah.
You only have to be lucky. You have to be lucky every time. We only have to be lucky once.
Yeah.
Which I think I saw was on some inspirational quotes once, and I was like, that shouldn't be on the inspirational quote wall. But yeah, look, they were quick to claim responsibility for the attacks, but I'm not too sure exactly how quickly was it. The next day, or was it a couple of weeks? But again, it was a very, I don't want to say the perfect crime, but like the person who carried out the bombing was long gone by then. He was back over in the Republic of Ireland. So how do you find someone when you've so little to go on? And it goes back to those, what's the word of it? The records that you sign. Any guest in the hotel over the past 6 months would have had to sign into a book with their details. So all of those were combed over, thousands and thousands of guests, and cross-checked and cross-referenced to make sure they were real people. And in the end, Roy Walsh was the only one that just didn't add up. That it was like, okay, this must be our bomber. So, yeah. And then I haven't got the full details of it, so maybe read the book, guy, whoever's watching. But it all goes down to that kind of fragment of a thumbprint or of a palm print that he put on the card. And eventually led back to Pat McGee, because I think, did the Irish Gardaí have him? Or he was on some database anyway. And so eventually they believed it was Pat McGee. They wanted him for questioning, but they didn't want to announce it publicly. So they were tailing him, and they found him hiding out in Ballymun, I think, in Dublin. So he was basically, his wife was traveling from Belfast to Dublin, and they figured he'd be trying to meet her. Mm-hmm. So they secretly tailed her. Then they found him in Dublin, but they were afraid this is English police now, maybe Irish Gardaí, but in this case, I'm not sure exactly which one, but the fear was if they arrested him in Dublin, they would not be able to extradite him back to England to face charges, because if Pat McGee claimed that his human rights were at risk, say if he was getting a prejudiced, he'd get a prejudiced court case, then, he could remain in Ireland. So they just waited. They were waiting on trying to get him to cross into the Northern Ireland or cross over again into England, and then they were going to arrest him. And during that time, he disappeared. So it was a gamble that didn't exactly pay off. It was quite dangerous, because this was the Brighton bomber. If he's gone dark now, he could be back in England planning another bombing, which is what he was doing.
Yeah, I mean, you get away with it once, and it didn't have the results, I suppose, that he was hoping for. I'm sure that was something that he was going to try and, I suppose, get back to, and plan another one, like you said. But tell us then a little bit about, I suppose, the aftermath of Patrick McGee. He did eventually face trial.
Yeah, so he because he didn't know he was on the radar, he snuck back into the UK. And it wasn't Pat McGee, it was a bomb maker from Belfast who was on a fishing trawler who came over into Scotland, who the police were tailing. And then they were like, he's going over to meet the people planning bombings in England. If we follow him, we'll get the potential bombers. So it was this really kind of interesting chase around, was it Glasgow? It was a Scottish city anyway, I can't remember. But they were all on the lookout for the man with a piece of his finger missing, because that was Pat McGee. He had a little bit of his little finger gone. So there was some meeting in a train station where a couple who were wearing the face off each other, but in reality they were both undercover police officers who were watching. And that's where they saw the two men meet, and they tailed them back to an apartment. But they didn't know which apartment they were in, so they had to get a police unit for every single apartment, and they all went in at the same time. And they're expecting to go in and find him hiding somewhere, whatever. So they knocked on the first door, and Pat McGee opened the door. So he was there with a provisional IRA cell planning another attack.
Wow.
So yeah, and it was one of those things where they found everything they needed in the apartment, but the most important part was they found a bomb calendar on one of the men. It was a huge mistake by the Provisional IRA to have, here is a list of all of our targets and when the bombs will go off. and then using that information. I think they only had one bomb to defuse, but they found, the Provisional IRA's entire bombing cell strategies, and they caught everybody. So it was a very successful, it was a very successful police case, but the whole thing is fascinating. The investigation for you, it's so interesting.
It is. And actually the finger, did he remove it on purpose because he thought that part of his fingerprint was on the...
Oh, I didn't know that.
Or did he? That's what I'm saying. Did he? Or was that just an accident?
I don't think it was making a bomb. I don't know if he removed it on purpose. So I feel like I'd remember that if it was. So I don't think that was the case.
That's quite interesting that if you can, I suppose, be somebody who's experimenting with bomb making and probably get away with just the top of your finger being blown off.
So I think it must have been just in a previous life or something else. But I just think it's one of those things we have to look for the man with the missing finger.
That's quite interesting, actually, because I suppose when you look at it, you're saying, oh, this was so long ago, there was no internet, but this is 40 years ago. Like, that is still quite a significant in terms of how different investigations go.
This was a massive case.
Yeah.
An absolutely massive case. Yeah. It's phenomenal. It was a phenomenal level of research that found him and tailed him and arrested him. It's a fascinating thing to read about,
Absolutely. And tell us about, I suppose, your thoughts on the book. Because, if this is something you're interested in, we can't go through the full story. We want you to go and read this book. Did you think that the book was well-researched, accurate? I've seen some, criticism that the book was a bit too padded out with information, but did you find that was the case? Or did you think that it kind of added to the overall narrative?
It pushed out like a lovely narrative. Like I just took a excerpt here I quite liked. It made it readable. There's so many books on the Troubles that are purely academic.
Yeah.
So I will take them, I will distill them, and I will make a very simple episode because otherwise it's inaccessible to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I feel like this book just strikes that perfectly. It's really well written, really interestingly written, almost reads like a novel.
Yeah.
It's telling you history. Yeah, you don't know it. So that's kind of the thing. So again, it's just 2 sentences, I think, but this is a part of the countdown for the bomb. 50 seconds from detonation, the only sound on the Brighton promenade came from the English Channel. The tide was high, waves thudding ashore, a few fishermen standing in the surf like moonlit sentinels.
That's beautiful.
That's completely written. Yeah. And that's this is a history book.
Yeah.
So that sort of writing wouldn't factor into a lot of the books that I read. So that's probably why I enjoyed this so much.
Yeah, and that's something I also enjoyed about it. I suppose this book, again, like you said, it does kind of read like a thriller. It's kind of like a spy thriller, political thriller, but also obviously murder mystery thriller. But one thing I loved about it was the fact I had just read Say Nothing, and probably one of my favorite books of all time, and I loved it. And when I first started Say Nothing, I was like, this is nothing to do with anything. Like, how are we going to come back to this? And it didn't make sense. And then obviously it's quite a big book. As you got through it, you're like, oh, that's why.
It's perfect.
It's the perfect
number
book.
One book I recommend to people about the Troubles.
Oh, it's incredible. Really, really well written. But when I came to this and I realised it was I wouldn't say copying the style, but I would say it had that kind of same for me. I was like, well, why are we reading about Mountbatten? Like, this is nothing to do with anything. Yeah. But then you kind of realise, well, actually, no. If you're coming at it, exactly. Yeah. If you're coming at it kind of from that perspective, and you want to learn and kind of read it from that way, it is very, I would highly recommend this as well. It is something that you can really sink your teeth into and learn a lot from and enjoy.
It pretends to see inside the thought process of Thatcher. It pretends to see inside the thought process of Pat McGee, which I like. So I don't know if to say fictionalized, but in a way it is, because it's trying to understand what these people would be thinking, speaking from their perspective. And I really enjoy that. I just think it's really interesting. There was a lot of auxiliary characters that kind of came into it. I really enjoyed learning about bomb doctors. I'd never thought about bomb doctors, but there's a very seminal image of the Troubles of a guy in full bomb diffusal gear and a graffiti on the wall saying, "Prepare to meet thy maker." And he's walking forward to defuse a bomb. And that sort of, when he was talking about them, it reminded me of that imagery. But I think it was one of the most dangerous jobs in the British Army, was to be a bomb disposal person, because the IRA bombs were really well booby-trapped. It was very difficult to defuse them. So yeah, I just liked learning all the extra stuff that informed the story. I think worked really well,
And what about, I suppose, in terms of, I think everything that we create, something we write, something we speak about, everything comes from sort of a place of bias, no matter who you are, where you're from, because you have obviously only one lived experience. what do you think in terms of this book? Do you think it was balanced in terms of coming at it from, Rory Carroll's perspective? Or do you think that he was able to kind of be non-biased and kind of be non-partisan and kind of focus on what it was like for both sides? Or do you think he was sympathetic with one side more than the other?
I think he wrote a great story. And I think he wrote it the way, I only hope I write my episodes the way he does, which is he just tells it as it is. He added more adjectives, I guess. He made it, I quite enjoy the writing style. I don't feel like he was adopting there are a couple of words when it comes to writing and talking about the Troubles. Like, was he killed? Was he murdered? Was he assassinated? Is he a terrorist? Is he paramilitary? There's a lot of words that instantly people who will be on one side will start to jump down your throat and say, you can't say that, you can't say that.
Yeah.
And I don't feel like in this context, in this book, I feel like it just it put the story out there. It made an interesting read and let you come to your own conclusions. And that's my objective in everything I write. So whether I do that successfully or not, I don't know.
And you think it's an accessible book?
Yeah, very much so. Again, it's one that you don't have to know a lot about the Troubles in Northern Ireland to jump into. And that's another thing I like as well. Just you jump in, it's an interesting story, and you'll gently be learning piece by piece by piece by piece as you go through the book. So yeah, they aren't all this accessible. One of the ones we did was, what was it called? Country by Michael Hughes. And it was telling of the Troubles through the story of the Iliad.
Okay.
And I hadn't a clue what was going on. Maybe it would help if I knew the story of the Iliad, but I read it and I was just so confused.
Yeah.
So, and again, I feel like that's a really good book. I just wish I was smarter. But at the same time, this for me is a great, my number one book to recommend about the Troubles will always be Say Nothing. This will be my number two.
What other books would you recommend? Because like I said, I've only recently started reading my books on the Troubles, and I'm very interested in that kind of politics. And again, I find it hard to come to something that's accessible, with my knowledge and experience of it. Again, like we're both probably kids of post the Good Friday Agreement. So, we'll be coming at it from a very different perspective from, our older generations or our parents might be.
I have so many books. It's a very hard to think of. I love...
Not to put you on the spot now.
The most... who did I do an interview with recently? Ricky O'Raw.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So Ricky O'Raw was the comms person for the IRA during the hunger strikes. He's had a very successful writing career post paramilitary activity, basically. So he did In the Name of the Sun. But the way he writes his books, fascinating. His book about the hunger strikes is brilliant. He's just a really excellent writer, and he's a great chatter too. I had him on the podcast this year. Martin Doyle, who is the photos guy for the Irish Times, I think.
Oh, yes. He is a very recent book out, doesn't he?
Yeah, Dirty Linen, and it's getting all sorts of accolades. I found it a difficult read. I found it very... I just found it a little bit tough, but it's getting all sorts of really wonderful praise. So maybe I need to give it another go. But it's basically an autobiographical time growing up in what was called, I think, was it the murder triangle or the killing triangle, which was, in the heart of where the Glenanne gang were operating. So you were just seeing Catholic civilians, a lot of death. So that book felt more like a chronological telling of the events, which is very interesting. So I need to give it another go, I think.
And what about when you, like you mentioned, Ricky O'Raw, when you kind of interview people like that for the podcast, do they have any sort of reckoning with their past? Do you ever get into that with them and how they might look back? Like, what is their perspective on it now? Do you find it varies from person to person?
Yeah, a lot of Republicans, a lot of ex-Republican paramilitaries will basically say, I did what needed to be done. And there's nothing else there in it, And again, like it's kind of the gotcha question. You see Fine Gael throwing over to Sinn Féin, like, oh, do you regret the violence? In a way, they can't regret the violence. So it makes for a good gotcha question because they have to support the actions of the Provisional IRA, even the abhorrent ones, I guess, in a way. So yeah, no, the most Republicans, let's see, who are the ones I've talked to? Yeah, it just depends. Like say Ricky O'Raw is kind of on the other side. I straight away asked him, I was like, oh, what were you doing there? And he was like, I'm not going to tell you what I was doing there. I was like, oh yeah, sorry. Like, we're doing a lot of legal stuff. And I was talking to another guy who described shooting a British soldier before as well. And you have to just kind of be, a lot of them, this is why there's so much secrecy and this is why it's such a difficult thing to get out. People are still afraid they can get tried and get prosecuted for the actions they carried out 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I've never really met a Republican who regrets or anything like that. None of the ones they did their role And that's how they see that, I've not yet to talk to a loyalist. I've been trying to get loyalists on. A lot of loyalists, from what my experience, seem to have turned to God more so than Republicans. Okay. A lot of ex-Republicans seem to work, I don't know, if you go to Derry, a lot of ex-Republicans work as tour guides talking about what has happened. But it seems that a lot of ex-loyalists, maybe this is a sweeping statement, but have turned to God and don't even talk about their past.
And do you think that's a way of putting a wall up to say, well, I'm not talking about that now because I'm a different person, I've atoned for my sins? Yeah.
Well, that's sure. Patrick McGee was the same. McGee served 14 years and then he got out and he toured with the daughter of a man who was killed in the Brighton bomb. And, they kind of did a peace and reconciliation tour where they talked about if we can go on tour together, then anyone can. This guy killed my father. But I've had 2 people reach out to Pat McGee to try and get him on the podcast, and he doesn't want to, he spent 5 to 10 years of his life maybe being in the IRA and being a bomber and killing, causing this amount of death. And he spent the subsequent maybe 30, 40 years of his life trying to be on the other side, to be, a peaceful individual or talk about peace and reconciliation. So does he deserve that? Does he deserve to be given the podium after the violence he carried out? It's hard to know. It's hard to tell. But he doesn't want to talk about his paramilitary time. He wants to talk about a life past that. So,
which is kind of interesting as well. So when it comes to the podcast, do you get, and I suppose this is again going back to the non-partisan kind of, trying to be unbiased. Obviously you grew up in a certain set of circumstances in the Republic of Ireland. Your name, very Irish. Do people come to it and think, oh, he's going to be Republican, he's going to be biased? Or is that something you get in trouble for, I suppose, with the audience? I guess in troubles with them?
I've been accused of everything. I've been absolutely accused. I don't call it Londonderry. It's officially Londonderry, but it's Irish people call it Derry. I just call it Derry. It's that simple. I've been accused of Shooneanism. I've never even heard of that word. But so yeah, I've got some real nasty reviews. It happens.
Yeah.
But the good thing about the bad reviews, of which there are very few, is they come from all sides.
Yeah.
So that guy is pro-UK, that guy is pro-Republican, that guy is pro. So yeah, I think for the most part, getting the fewer bad reviews that do come in, if they're telling me if they're coming in from all sides, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Look, my name is Oisin Feeney. Of course, it's going to look like I would be of a certain persuasion. And I am aware of that when I do write. Maybe there is an implicit bias. I did an episode on Ian Paisley and I kind of, after the episode, I was like, could I have said more nicer things about him? Did I just focus on the bad things? So I'm always kind of checking myself a little bit and trying to, and I tell people it's an imperfect work. I'm not a historian, not a journalist. I think when people forget that podcasts are held up to no journalistic standards. When I worked for another newspaper in this building before, if I put out an article that had some issue in it, straight away, people are like, get that down, take that down now. But in this industry that I work in, I could say anything. Or say nothing. But I think it's very important for people to be aware of where they get their information from and to be aware that I make mistakes. If it's getting the overall point across and then this is a great stepping off point for you to learn more, then that's my aim accomplished, And
tell us a bit about why you actually started it in the first place, because that's, maybe not an odd thing for you to do, but it's certainly, maybe not the first thing that will come to many people's minds if they want to start a podcast. Let me just go down the most complicated way possible, straight to the troubles.
I don't know. I finished media in Maynooth 15 years ago. I moved to Chicago and I was like, I'll apply for an internship at This American Life. That seems doable. I'll get that job. And then I realized it was the most popular internship in America or something, 50,000 applications or something.
Wow.
Didn't get that. And I didn't look at podcasts again for 10, 12 years. And then I just said I always wanted to do a podcast. I always wanted to do something. I loved Case File, deadpan telling of true crime. And then, I think, I don't know when it was, about a year before COVID, I just came across the assassination of Mountbatten. And I was like, Mountbatten was a very controversial character. The plot was very interesting. The quest to catch the bombers was interesting. And then the ethical issue, how ethical is that? So all of those story beats for me sounded fascinating. So I said, okay. And then I looked up online, is there anything in the podcast space about the Troubles? No. Loads of documentaries, falling into history in YouTube, or even really hard to get in YouTube. Loads of books. So there has to be a space in the middle to take this and make it accessible. So if I did every episode, each episode is totally open closed. You don't need to listen to the one before, the one after. It's like jigsaw telling of the Troubles and all out of sequence.
Yeah.
That is gradually giving people kind of they're in. So I made I remember going on a hike in Carlingford with my friend and I was like, can I say this word? He's like, no, you cannot say that word. I was like, can I say this word? So I was kind of figuring out how is the tone going to be? How do I kind of get this? So I got a pilot. I did 3 episodes, sent them around to a few friends. And I just started to get really good feedback. So I said, okay, the Troubles podcast, let's go. And some people would really hate the name Troubles because they'd find that Troubles a diminutive. And I was like, yeah, I know, but like no one would find it if I called it anything else, because that is a lot of people have come to it from just Googling. They want to learn more about a podcast on the Troubles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right there.
So it's 4 or 5 years in now and it's tough, but I don't know how many episodes I can do. I don't know how much like writing on the Troubles I can do, but I reckon I could get to at least 100. I'm at 70 now.
I think it's probably infinite, to be fair.
Yeah.
And tell us, you are Podcast of the Year.
Yeah.
That you won at the Irish Podcast Awards. Tell us about that, because this is a funny story.
Oh.
You won 2 awards that night.
Yeah, I won 2 awards at the Irish Podcast Awards last November. So where do I even start this story? So I have this wonderful guy called John Livingston who he has He has the Troubles archive over on Instagram. Mm-hmm. Really interested in the Troubles. So I was nominated for the awards and I said to John, here, come on over. We'll have a good bit of crack. There's no chance we're going to win anything, but sure, we'll have a rake of pints and have a good night. So, because I was nominated in the history category and like it was against Bertie Ahern. And like in my application, I use clips of my Bertie Ahern interview. So I was like, I'm never going to beat him using his own voice against him. And the Belfast Telegraph and the Irish Independent, I think. And like, so it was just, I was like, there's no way I'm going to win. It's a tiny podcast. Or well, it's a big enough podcast, but it doesn't have the backing of these big guys in the background, I guess. So, and even my dad, I was telling him about it and he was like, just, look, have a good night with John. Just don't be late or anything. I was like, thanks, Dad. So, so me and John rocked up. We did the, both feeling a bit out of our usual place, I guess. And, we sat down and then it was like the 3rd award of maybe 20. And it was like, and I leaned over to John and I was like, you know what, maybe I'll get runner-up. So they announced runner-up and they're like Bertie Ahern. And I was like, okay, then don't stand a chance. And they're like, and the winner of History Podcast of the Year is Oisin Feeney. Or the Troubles podcast. And I was like, what? So ran up on stage, got the award. I couldn't believe it. Like I absolutely couldn't. So John was exploding beside me. And I was like, here, let's just go out to the smoking area and like just have a drink. Because we went out there and we just started celebrating. And the thing is, like, as winners started to get awards, they all kind of gravitated out there as well. So we end up like, we were meant to only go out for one drink. We stayed out there for like the whole hour and a half or whatever, having a really good time. And then out of the blue, like a woman just tapped me and she's like, oh, excuse me, are you Oisin Feeney? And I was like, oh yeah.
Oh no, what have I done?
And she was like, oh, you've just won another award. And I was like, no, I only entered the history category. And she's like, oh, you've won the overall Podcast of the Year award. And like, I was here with 2 beers in my hand, like, what? And so I run back in, everyone is leaving because like this is the only award that you get a speech. And I could just imagine me like as Father Ted, and now for the...
Yeah.
But so they waited around for me. No one could find me. You were texting me. And then they were like, okay, well, have a good night, guys. Bye. And then that's when I walked in when everyone was getting up to go. So everyone kind of petered out and I just walked up to the guys and took the award and apologized. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I had no idea there was a second award. I had no idea. So... yeah, we had a good night. Then we ended up with a couple of other people out and about and... yeah, it was a good...
But incredible.
Yeah, no, it was great. I was delighted. Yeah, it was... like it didn't change... It changed virtually nothing in my life, apart from the fact that there's these nice paperweights holding up my books now. But at the same time, it was a nice little bit of validation. And also that, like, it can still be done by just one person. You don't need to have the backing of anything or anyone or funding or anything. It can be recorded in your closet... in a pitch black closet, and if the effort is there. So it felt a little bit nicely validating, I guess. Yeah. Even though, to be honest, the best thing is when people reach out to you and tell you how they feel about it, and it's lovely. It's really, that stuff gives me the motivation to keep going.
Well, it was well deserved. You've done a couple of live shows. Tell us what is next for the Troubles.
I have no idea. I have no idea. I'm smack bang in the middle of season 5 right now, so I don't know whenever this will come out. So I just need to get that finished. In my other life, I work as like a I give tours of Ireland, private tours around Ireland. So this summer has just been super busy. And I found it really hard to write episodes. So yeah, if I get this season finished, I'll be very happy. I'm heading over to the London Crime Con, and that is it. I mean, I'd love to do another live show. I'd love to pitch a book at some stage. I've basically written it with the amount of episodes I have, but I need a good narrative weave. So I just
CrimeCon is always a fun place to be. This is where we first met.
Yeah.
We met actually, we were at the Scottish one days after Queen Elizabeth died. And
it's really strange, yeah.
It was very strange because the entire podcast, so they have like a podcast exhibitor hall, the entire hall had cleared out and went in for like the opening speech, and we were just sat at we were talking about a potential podcast that you had on the horizon. And somebody came up to us and was like, "Oh, we're just going to have a minute silence for the Queen if you'd like to come in." I was like, "Can you not see the name of the podcast we're sat at?" So we marched in anyway, and we had our minute silence, whatever. But it was a good time. Well, Oisin Feeney, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.